Hello and welcome. Today, I'm going to whisper to you about the real-life story of the infamous Dalton Gang, a group of outlaws who became legendary in the Old West for their daring bank and train robberies. Unlike the fictionalized versions of their story, the true tale of the Daltons is filled with ambition, betrayal, and a tragic end that has fascinated historians and storytellers for over a century. So, get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into the wild and dangerous world of the real Dalton Gang together. The Dalton Brothers were a notorious group of outlaws who became infamous in the American Old West during the late 19th century. The gang, made up primarily of brothers Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton, along with several associates, gained a reputation for their daring and often violent robberies of banks and trains. Their exploits have been romanticized in popular culture, but the real story of the Dalton Gang is one of desperation, ambition, and ultimately, tragedy. Who were the Dalton Brothers? The Dalton Brothers, Bob, Grat, Emmett, and Bill, were born into a large family in the post-Civil War era, in a time when the American frontier was still a rugged and lawless place. They were raised in Missouri and later moved to Oklahoma, which was then known as Indian Territory. The Daltons grew up in a time and place where the line between lawmen and outlaws was often blurred, and where opportunities for a stable and prosperous life were few and far between. The family was originally law-abiding, and several of the Dalton brothers began their careers in law enforcement. Bob and Grat served as U.S. deputy marshals, tasked with bringing criminals to justice in the chaotic and often violent frontier regions. However, the lure of easy money, combined with the challenges and frustrations they faced as lawmen, eventually led them down a darker path. By the early 1890s, the Daltons had turned from upholding the law to breaking it. They formed a gang that included not only the brothers but also other disillusioned men from the frontier. Together, they embarked on a spree of robberies that would make them one of the most infamous outlaw gangs in American history. The context of the Old West. The period during which the Dalton Gang operated was a time of great change and turmoil in the United States. The late 19th century, often referred to as the Wild West era, was marked by the rapid expansion of the American frontier. This was a time when new territories were being settled, railroads were being built, and the country was transitioning from its rural, agrarian roots to a more industrialized society. The expansion into the West brought with it both opportunity and conflict. Settlers moved into lands traditionally held by Native American tribes, leading to violent clashes and the displacement of indigenous peoples. The promise of wealth from mining, ranching, and railroads attracted people from all walks of life, but it also led to lawlessness and crime as outlaws sought to take advantage of the booming economy. Law enforcement in the West was often thinly stretched, and the rugged terrain made it difficult to maintain order. This environment allowed outlaws like the Dalton Gang to thrive. They exploited the weaknesses in law enforcement, targeting remote banks and trains, and using the vast and sparsely populated landscapes to evade capture. At the same time, the image of the outlaw became romanticized in American culture. Figures like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and the Daltons were seen by some as folk heroes, rebels who stood against the establishment even as their actions brought violence and suffering to others. The Dalton Gang story is a product of this unique period in American history, where the Old West was rapidly disappearing and the new, modern America was beginning to take shape. The Daltons, like many others, were caught between these two worlds, ultimately choosing a path that led to both infamy and destruction. The Dalton Brothers' transition from lawmen to outlaws is a fascinating and complex story rooted in the challenges and temptations of life on the American frontier. Their early years as lawmen exposed them to the harsh realities of enforcing the law on a lawless land, but it was the combination of personal ambition, frustration, and the lure of easy money that ultimately led them down the path of crime. From lawmen to outlaws, the early transition. The Dalton brothers initially tried to follow a respectable path. Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton, along with their older brother Frank, all served as lawmen at different points in their lives. Frank Dalton, the eldest brother, was a respected deputy U.S. Marshal who upheld the law with integrity. However, Frank's life was tragically cut short in 1887 when he was killed in a shootout while attempting to arrest a horse thief in Indian Territory. Frank's death had a profound impact on his younger brothers, who had looked up to him as a role model. Following Frank's death, Bob and Grat Dalton decided to follow in their brother's footsteps, becoming deputy U.S. Marshals themselves. They were tasked with enforcing the law in the Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, a region notorious for its lawlessness. The Indian Territory was a hotbed of criminal activity, with outlaws, cattle rustlers, and bandits operating with relative impunity due to the lack of effective law enforcement. The temptations and frustrations of law enforcement. As lawmen, Bob and Grat were quickly exposed to the dangers and frustrations of their new roles. The work was grueling, the pay was low, and the risks were high. They were often tasked with pursuing dangerous criminals across vast, unforgiving landscapes with little support and few resources. The Indian Territory was particularly challenging, as it was home to numerous outlaw gangs and offered ample hiding places for those on the run from the law. The Daltons' time as lawmen was also marked by disillusionment. They witnessed firsthand the corruption and inefficiency that plagued the justice system in the West. The pay they received as deputies was often insufficient to support their families, and the rewards for capturing outlaws were meager compared to the risks they took. This sense of injustice and frustration began to wear on them, particularly on Bob, who was known for his ambitious and impulsive nature. It wasn't long before the Daltons began to see the appeal of the outlaw life. The criminals they were chasing often flaunted their ill-gotten wealth, living in luxury compared to the hard and dangerous life of a lawman. Bob Dalton, in particular, grew increasingly resentful of the system that offered him so little in return for his service. He began to entertain the idea that he could do better by turning to crime himself. The first steps into crime. The Dalton brothers' descent into crime began gradually, starting with smaller acts of corruption. They were accused of stealing horses, a common crime in the West, but one that was considered serious. Horse theft was a capital offense in some areas, reflecting the importance of horses in the frontier economy. While the Daltons were never formally convicted, these accusations began to tarnish their reputations as lawmen. Bob Dalton, the youngest but most ambitious of the brothers, soon took the lead in pushing the family into more serious criminal activity. He believed that he could outsmart the law, using the knowledge he had gained as a lawman to evade capture. Bob convinced his brothers that they could make far more money robbing banks and trains than they ever could working as deputies. The transition from lawmen to outlaws was solidified in 1890 when the Daltons committed their first major crime, the attempted robbery of a Southern Pacific train in California. Bob and Emmett Dalton, along with a few associates, planned to rob the train as it passed through a remote area. However, the robbery was a disaster. The gang was poorly organized, and the train's guards were well prepared. the robbery was foiled, and the gang barely escaped with their lives. Despite the failure of their first major heist, the Dalton brothers were not deterred. Instead, the botched robbery only seemed to fuel their determination to succeed as outlaws. They returned to Indian Territory, where they regrouped and began planning more ambitious and daring crimes. This marked the true beginning of the Dalton Gang's life of crime. They would go on to commit a series of increasingly bold robberies, targeting trains and banks across the American frontier. Their actions would make them one of the most infamous outlaw gangs of the Old West, but it all began with their decision to turn away from the law and embrace a life of crime. Regrouping and laying low. In the immediate aftermath of the failed train robbery, the Dalton brothers, Bob, Grat, and Emmett, realized they needed to reassess their approach. The botched heist had been a humbling experience, exposing their lack of preparation and the challenges of executing large-scale crimes. They had barely escaped with their lives, and the close call served as a stark reminder of the dangers they now faced. For the first few weeks after the failed robbery, the Dalton brothers laid low, hiding out in remote areas of Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, and Kansas. This was a time of intense pressure, as they were now on the run from the law. Their former connections in law enforcement were no longer reliable, and they knew that the authorities would be searching for them. The brothers moved frequently to avoid detection, staying in isolated cabins and relying on the support of sympathetic locals who provided them with food and shelter. During this period, Bob Dalton, the de facto leader of the gang, began to rethink their strategy. He was determined to prove that they could succeed where others had failed, and his ambition drove him to push the gang towards more daring and well-planned operations. Bob was keenly aware that their next move needed to be executed flawlessly to restore their confidence and establish their reputation as outlaws to be reckoned with. Rebuilding the gang. As the Daltons regrouped, they also focused on recruiting new members to strengthen their gang. The failed robbery had underscored the importance of having a reliable and capable crew. Bob, Grat, and Emmett began reaching out to trusted associates and other outlaws they had met during their time as lawmen and during their earlier criminal activities. One of the key figures who joined the gang during this time was Bill Doolin, a skilled horseman and marksman who would later become a notorious outlaw in his own right. Doolin brought valuable experience and expertise to the gang, and his inclusion helped solidify the group's capabilities. Other recruits included Dick Broadwell, Bill Powers, and Charlie Pierce, who each had their own criminal backgrounds and skills that would prove useful in the gang's future endeavors. The Daltons were careful in selecting their associates, prioritizing loyalty and competence. They knew that trust was essential, especially in their line of work, where betrayal could mean the difference between life and death. The new members were integrated into the gang during this initial 6-month period, and the group spent time training, planning, and preparing for their next major heist. Planning the next robberies. With their numbers bolstered and their resolve strengthened, the Dalton Gang began planning their next series of robberies. They knew that their first major heist after the failed train robbery would need to be a success to establish their reputation and secure the financial rewards they were seeking. The gang targeted trains and banks, which were seen as lucrative but dangerous targets. They spent weeks gathering intelligence on their chosen targets, studying the schedules of trains, the layouts of banks, and the movements of law enforcement in the areas they planned to hit. Bob Dalton, in particular, was meticulous in his planning, determined to avoid the mistakes that had led to their earlier failure. During this time, the gang also fine-tuned their operational strategies. They practiced quick getaways, trained in marksmanship, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios they might encounter during a robbery. The Dalton brothers were aware that success required not just brute force, but careful planning and coordination, building a network of support. Another critical aspect of their activities during these 6 months was the development of a network of informants and sympathizers. The Daltons used their previous connections from their time as lawmen and their status as former members of the community to gather support. They built relationships with local ranchers, farmers, and other residents who were either sympathetic to their cause or could be persuaded with a share of the loot. This network provided the gang with valuable information about law enforcement activities, potential targets, and safe places to hide out. It also gave them a degree of protection, as the people they relied on for support were less likely to turn them into the authorities. This network would prove crucial in helping the Dalton gang evade capture and stay one step ahead of the law during the early stages of their criminal career. First successful robberies. By the end of this 6-month period, the Dalton gang had successfully pulled off a few smaller-scale robberies. These early successes were critical in boosting the gang's morale and confidence. While not as lucrative or high-profile as the heists they would later attempt, these initial robberies provided them with much-needed funds and the experience necessary to plan more ambitious operations. The gang's first successful train robbery took place near Wharton, Oklahoma, in May 1891, just as this initial 6-month period was drawing to a close. This heist was a turning point for the gang, as it demonstrated their ability to execute a complex operation and escape without being caught. The success of this robbery set the stage for the Dalton gang's rise to infamy and their subsequent string of more daring and dangerous crimes. In the 6 months following their first successful train robbery in May 1891, the Dalton gang continued to build on their newfound success, becoming bolder and more notorious as they embarked on a series of increasingly daring crimes. This period was marked by both triumph and growing tension within the gang as they pushed the limits of their abilities and began to draw the intense scrutiny of law enforcement. Expansion of operations. After the successful robbery near Wharton, Oklahoma, in May 1891, the Dalton gang was emboldened by their victory. The gang members, particularly Bob Dalton, saw this as validation of their strategy and skills. With a growing sense of confidence, they decided to expand their operations, targeting more lucrative and high-profile locations. During the next 6 months, the Dalton gang shifted their focus to a series of bank and train robberies across Kansas and Oklahoma. The gang meticulously planned each heist, using the experience they had gained in their earlier crimes to improve their methods. They conducted detailed surveillance of their targets, studying the routines of bank employees and train schedules, and identifying the best times to strike. The gang's strategy was to hit quickly and decisively, using their knowledge of the terrain and their network of informants to avoid capture. They typically struck small towns where law enforcement presence was minimal, allowing them to overwhelm any resistance and make a swift escape. The Daltons were also known for their use of disguises, which helped them blend in and avoid recognition before and after their crimes. Notable robberies. One of the most significant robberies during this period occurred in August 1891 when the Dalton gang targeted the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad. The gang carefully planned this robbery, selecting a remote location where they could ambush the train with minimal interference. On the night of the robbery, the gang managed to stop the train by placing an obstruction on the tracks. As the train came to a halt, the gang swiftly boarded, overpowering the guards and forcing the crew to open the express car, where the most valuable cargo was stored. The Daltons made off with a substantial amount of cash and valuables, further solidifying their reputation as successful outlaws. The robbery was widely reported in the newspapers, with the Dalton Gang quickly becoming infamous throughout the region. Despite their growing notoriety, the Daltons managed to evade capture, thanks in large part to their careful planning and the support of their network. They were able to hide out in remote areas, moving frequently to avoid detection. The gang also had the advantage of familiarity with the local terrain, which allowed them to outmaneuver any posses that were sent after them. Internal tensions and leadership struggles. As the Dalton Gang continued their spree of robberies, internal tensions began to surface within the group. Bob Dalton, as the leader, was becoming increasingly ambitious and driven by the desire to achieve greater success and wealth. His leadership style was often authoritarian, and he was known for being impulsive and quick to anger. Grad and Emmett Dalton, while loyal to their brother, began to question some of Bob's decisions. Grad, in particular, was more cautious and less inclined to take unnecessary risks. He recognized the growing danger posed by their increasing notoriety and was concerned that Bob's ambition might lead the gang into situations that could be their undoing. These tensions were further exacerbated by the pressure of constantly being on the run. The life of an outlaw was grueling, with little rest and constant vigilance required to avoid capture. The stress of this lifestyle began to take a toll on the gang members, leading to frayed nerves and disagreements about their next moves. Despite these internal struggles, the Dalton brothers remained united in their determination to continue their life of crime. They understood that there was no turning back. They had already crossed too many lines to return to a lawful existence. The stakes were higher than ever, and the brothers knew that any mistake could be fatal. Increased law enforcement pressure. By late 1891, law enforcement agencies were intensifying their efforts to capture the Dalton Gang. The gang's string of successful robberies had drawn the attention of both local sheriffs and federal marshals, who were determined to bring the outlaws to justice. The Dalton brothers were now among the most wanted men in the West, and substantial rewards were offered for their capture, dead or alive. The increased pressure from law enforcement made it more difficult for the gang to operate. The Daltons found themselves constantly on the move, unable to stay in one place for long. They relied heavily on their network of informants and sympathizers to stay ahead of the law, but the noose was slowly tightening around them. As a result, the gang had to become even more careful in their planning and execution of robberies. They avoided large towns and well-guarded targets, focusing instead on smaller, more vulnerable locations. However, this also meant that the rewards were smaller, leading to frustration among the gang members who were eager for bigger scores. Preparations for larger heists. Despite the growing danger, Bob Dalton was determined to pull off a major heist that would cement their legacy and provide them with enough money to escape the outlaw life. Throughout the latter part of 1891, the gang began planning a series of more ambitious robberies, including simultaneous hits on multiple banks in the same town, a bold and unprecedented move that would require precise coordination and flawless execution. The gang scouted potential targets, gathering information on bank layouts, security measures, and the response times of local law enforcement. Bob believed that such a daring robbery would not only provide a huge financial windfall but also demonstrate their superiority as outlaws. However, the risks were immense, and the gang members knew that a single misstep could lead to their capture or death. Planning the Coffeeville heist. As 1892 began, the Dalton Gang focused intensely on their most ambitious plan yet, simultaneously robbing 2 banks in Coffeeville, Kansas. Bob Dalton was fixated on this idea, seeing it as the ultimate heist that would not only bring them a massive payday but also secure their legacy as the most daring outlaws in the West. The gang spent January refining their plan, making multiple covert trips to Coffeeville to gather detailed intelligence on the banks, the town's layout, and the movements of law enforcement. Bob's meticulous approach left little to chance. He assigned specific roles to each gang member, ensuring they knew exactly what to do once the robbery began. However, this level of planning also led to growing tensions within the gang, especially with Grat Dalton, who worried that Bob's ambition might push them too far. Despite these concerns, the gang pressed on, driven by the promise of a massive payoff. Securing resources. As they moved into February, the Dalton Gang began to gather the necessary resources for the Coffeeville heist. This included acquiring additional firearms, ammunition, and horses to ensure they were fully prepared for the operation. The gang also secured several hideouts in the surrounding countryside where they could lay low before and after the robbery. During this time, Bob Dalton took a firmer grip on the gang's activities, insisting on repeated rehearsals of the heist plan. The gang members practiced their roles with military precision, focusing on timing, coordination, and escape strategies. However, this increased pressure only heightened the existing tensions within the group. Grat Dalton's concerns about the risks involved grew, leading to more frequent clashes with Bob. Emmett, caught between his brothers, tried to mediate, but the strain was palpable. Mounting law enforcement pressure. As the Dalton Gang continued their preparations, law enforcement's efforts to capture them intensified. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, along with U.S. Marshals and local sheriffs, was closing in, making it increasingly difficult for the gang to operate freely. The Daltons had to remain constantly on the move, using their network of informants to stay ahead of the law. Despite these challenges, Bob Dalton remained determined to see the Coffeeville plan through. He was aware of the risks, but believed that the potential reward justified them. The gang knew that the pressure was mounting, but they were committed to the plan, driven by the prospect of one last, massive score that would allow them to retire from their life of crime. Final preparations and growing tensions. By March and April, the Dalton Gang was in the final stages of their preparations. They finalized their escape routes, identified safe houses where they could hide out, and made contingency plans in case things went wrong. The tension within the gang was at an all-time high, with Bob pushing the gang members to perfect their roles while Grat and Emmett voiced growing concerns about the plan's viability. Despite these internal struggles, the gang remained focused on their goal. Bob was determined to pull off the Coffeeville heist, seeing it as the culmination of their criminal careers. However, the increasing pressure from law enforcement and the heightened stakes of the operation meant that any mistake could prove fatal. The lead up to the Coffeeville heist. As May and June of 1892 arrived, the Dalton Gang knew that the time for action was drawing near. They conducted final reconnaissance missions in Coffeeville, double-checking their information and ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Bob Dalton was relentless in his pursuit of perfection, knowing that the success of the heist depended on flawless execution. The gang members were on edge, fully aware of the dangers they faced. They knew that law enforcement was closing in and that the Coffeeville heist would likely be their last chance to secure the wealth they needed to escape their outlaw lives. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, one that would either secure their place in history or lead to their ultimate downfall. escalation, and refinement of plans. As the summer of 1892 progressed, the Dalton Gang found themselves both emboldened and increasingly desperate. Their audacious plan to rob 2 banks simultaneously in Coffeeville had become the focal point of their existence, and every action they took during these months was geared toward ensuring its success. The gang spent July and August refining their plans, gathering additional resources, and trying to address the internal tensions that had begun to threaten their cohesion. Bob Dalton, as the mastermind behind the Coffeeville heist, pushed the gang members harder than ever. He insisted on frequent meetings to discuss every possible scenario that might arise during the robbery. The gang members practiced their roles repeatedly, with Bob drilling them on timing, coordination, and how to handle any unexpected resistance. Bob's relentless focus on the details was both a strength and a source of strain within the gang. Grad Dalton continued to express concerns about the risks involved, particularly the increased attention from law enforcement. He worried that the growing notoriety of the Dalton Gang would make it impossible for them to escape unscathed, even if the robbery itself was successful. Emmett, who remained loyal to both brothers, tried to calm the situation but was increasingly caught in the middle of their disagreements. Heightened law enforcement activity. By September 1892, law enforcement agencies had significantly ramped up their efforts to capture the Dalton Gang. The gang's previous successes had attracted the attention of not just local sheriffs, but also the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and federal marshals. The authorities were now working together, sharing intelligence and coordinating their efforts to track down the outlaws. The Dalton Gang was aware of the heightened surveillance and the increasing number of posses being dispatched to hunt them down. They responded by moving even more cautiously, using their network of informants to stay ahead of the law. However, this constant need to remain vigilant added to the stress within the gang, leading to further arguments and frayed nerves. Despite the growing pressure, Bob Dalton remained resolute. He believed that their careful planning would allow them to outsmart the authorities and pull off the Coffeeville heist without getting caught. He also knew that the gang's window of opportunity was closing. If they didn't act soon, the increasing law enforcement presence would make it impossible to carry out such a high-profile operation. Finalizing the Coffeeville heist. As October approached, the Dalton Gang began making their final preparations for the Coffeeville heist. They conducted their last reconnaissance missions in the town, confirming the layout of the banks, the schedules of the employees, and the positioning of local law enforcement. Bob Dalton insisted on running through the plan one last time, ensuring that every gang member knew their role and could execute it without hesitation. The gang members were on edge, fully aware of the risks they were about to take. The tension within the group was palpable, with even the normally confident Bob Dalton showing signs of strain. Grad's concerns about the plan's dangers had not subsided, and he was now openly questioning whether the potential reward was worth the risk. Emmett, though anxious, remained committed to his brothers and the plan. The night before the planned robbery, the gang gathered in one of their hideouts to finalize their strategy. The atmosphere was tense, with each member understanding that this would likely be their last job, one way or another. They discussed their escape routes in detail, identifying potential safe houses and planning contingencies for every possible scenario. Bob Dalton made it clear that there could be no mistakes. They had to execute the plan perfectly if they were to have any chance of success. The day of the heist. On the morning of October 5th, 1892, the Dalton Gang rode into Coffeeville with a mix of anticipation and dread. They were disguised, hoping to blend in with the townspeople until the moment they struck. The plan was simple but audacious. Bob and Emmett would rob the C.M. Condon and Company bank, while Grat and the other gang members would simultaneously hit the First National Bank. The gang split up as they entered the town, each group heading toward their assigned bank. As they neared their targets, the tension reached its peak. Every member of the gang knew that they were about to embark on the most dangerous operation of their lives. The plan hinged on timing and precision. If anything went wrong, their chances of escape would be slim. The robbery in progress. As the Dalton Gang initiated their heist, the situation quickly escalated. Bob and Emmett entered the C.M. Condon and Company bank, drawing their weapons and ordering the employees and customers to hand over the cash. At the same time, Grat and his group did the same at the First National Bank. The gang had hoped to complete the robbery quickly and make a swift getaway, but things began to unravel almost immediately. Unbeknownst to the Daltons, the townspeople of Coffeeville had recognized them despite their disguises. Word spread quickly, and within minutes, a group of armed citizens had gathered outside the banks, ready to confront the outlaws. The gang members, realizing that they were surrounded, began to panic. The carefully laid plans were falling apart, and the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. As the gang tried to make their escape, they were met with a hail of gunfire from the townspeople. The streets of Coffeeville erupted into chaos as the gang members fought desperately to break free. The tension and fear that had been building for months finally reached a deadly climax, with bullets flying and bodies falling in the streets. The aftermath. The Coffeeville heist ended in tragedy for the Dalton Gang. Bob and Grat Dalton were killed in the shootout, along with several other gang members. Emmett Dalton, though severely wounded, survived and was captured by the townspeople. The failed heist marked the end of the Dalton Gang's criminal career, and their story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the inevitable consequences of a life of crime. In the days following the heist, Coffeeville became the focus of national attention. The bodies of the slain outlaws were put on public display, and newspapers across the country reported on the dramatic downfall of the Dalton Gang. For the surviving members, particularly Emmett, the aftermath was a time of reflection and regret. The gang's final, desperate attempt to secure wealth and infamy had instead led to their destruction. The story of the Dalton Gang, particularly their dramatic rise and fall, has left an indelible mark on popular culture. Their exploits during the late 19th century have been immortalized in countless books, movies, and television shows, making them one of the most infamous outlaw groups in the history of the American West. The Dalton Gang's legacy is significant not only because of their daring crimes, but also because of the way their story embodies the themes of ambition, brotherhood, and the inevitable downfall that often accompanies a life of crime. The gang's final, ill-fated heist in Coffeeville, Kansas, has become a legendary tale of hubris and tragedy, serving as a cautionary story about the dangers of overreaching. In popular culture, the Dalton Brothers have been portrayed as both ruthless outlaws and tragic figures, with their story being adapted into numerous films and TV series. The image of the Daltons riding into Coffeeville with the intention of pulling off the greatest heist in history, only to be met with their demise, has captivated audiences for generations. Their story has become symbolic of the lawlessness and danger of the Old West, capturing the imagination of those fascinated by this tumultuous period in American history. Beyond their portrayal in media, the Dalton Gang's story has also influenced the broader narrative of the American outlaw, contributing to the romanticized image of the Wild West that persists to this day. Their blend of ambition, audacity, and ultimate failure serves as a powerful reminder of the fine line between infamy and oblivion. As we conclude this exploration of the Dalton Gang, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the American West. But now, I ask you, how do you see the Dalton Gang? Were they simply criminals, or do they represent something more about the spirit of that era? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more fascinating stories from history. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the incredible tales of our past.